Well, you did everything you could to undermine this report. You didn't cooperate. You didn't give them access to Israel. But it's here in black and white now, led by a former US Supreme Court judge. Impunity prevails across the board for violations committed by Israeli forces.
We took a decision, a rightful decision, not to cooperate for very good reason. The UN Human Rights Council, as my Prime Minister just said, has spent more time singling out Israel than any other country on the planet, more than Iran, North Korea, Syria, countries with atrocious human rights records. And that's because we've seen the politicization of this body. Instead of dealing with serious issues of human rights, it's become a vehicle just to single out. I think my Prime Minister used the term to be obsessed with Israel in a way that's been totally unfair. Not just Mark Regev says so. Two Secretary Generals of the United Nations,
yes,
both the current Secretary
But this was
General,
led by a former US Supreme
and the previous
Court
one.
judge.
So,
you know, criminals
though,
often say the judge had it in for me.
Secretary Generals of the United Nations, if Secretary Generals of the United Nations are criticizing this body, not just Israel, it means that there's some weight to the criticism.
It's always the judge that has it in for you if you're a criminal who refuses to recognize the court. The point is, it wasn't just rogue acts that this report has identified. It was systematic. It was the way you were bombing Gaza that they find at fault, and your refusal to change policy after massive civilian casualties had been identified.
Once again, you're talking about a report that's been produced by a body which is biased. Now, Israel does cooperate with UN reports when we understand that they're going to be fair and impartial. We cooperated just a month ago with a report by the Secretary General about the same conflict. We didn't want to cooperate, and we chose not to cooperate because if you actually read the mandate that this report had, this Human Rights Council, so-called Human Rights Council had, it declared Israel guilty before the report was even.
I'm asking you to engage with
it.
the point, right? You know, put aside. Okay, we get that you think they're biased. You don't recognise the report, but engage with the substance of what I'm saying.
The UN Secretary General and the previous Secretary General have both said that there's a bias.
It's your view we're dealing with now. You know, identify with or engage with the actual point, which is that after you had killed those boys on the beach, because you said you couldn't distinguish them between children and militants, your bombing campaign continued in the same vein. The question is, if you couldn't tell the difference between children and militants, why were you bombing in that way? Well,
the issue of the boys on the beach was a tragedy, and we publicly apologized for it.
But it
continued,
know it was a mistake. Didn't it?
But
there were 551 children
No, but you have to make a
killed.
distinction. But let's be fair. Let's be fair, sir. The war continued because Hamas repeatedly rejected ceasefires. The first ceasefire was put on the table 5-6 days into the war by the Arab League, which Israel accepted. Hamas said no. They kept shooting the rockets in Israel. They kept rejecting the ceasefire. We were ready to stop this war, as I said, 1 week into the conflict. Do you know that 90% of the casualties occurred in that period following the week? And in the end, Hamas, as you've reported on Channel 4, accepted the very same ceasefire 5 weeks later.
But why
was the conflict continuing?
But the thing that is most disturbing as well is that the Commission identifies the fact that you have closed your investigation into that initial killing of those 4 children on the beach without interviewing many of the eyewitnesses and many of the international journalists who saw what happened. There doesn't seem to be a real desire on Israel's part to find the truth.
No, I disagree totally. First of all, the decision of our military advocate general is open to public scrutiny, and anyone who believes that he's made the wrong decision is free, according to our laws, to appeal his decision both to the Attorney General of Israel, the civilian legal official, and to appeal to the independent Israeli Supreme Court, which, as you know, is renowned internationally for its professionalism and its justice. So we have a system where there are checks and balances in place, where there's civilian review of these decisions by the military legal structure. But it's very important, if you'll allow me to say, very important to distinguish between what is an honest accident in war and a war crime. I spoke to you once before. There was a very famous incident in the Second World War where the RAF targeted the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen. And the bombs went astray and hit an orphanage, and many innocent children were killed. Now, that was a tragedy, a real tragedy. But it's an honest mistake in combat. It's not a war crime. You have to distinguish, as does international law.
Thank you for joining us tonight, Mark Regev.